An interesting aspect of the success of Bugatti's racing cars in the period 1925-26 was that his son Roland, who was born in 1922 and therefore was a young boy of 5 or 6, he wanted his own toy car. So his father built for him a little model car, which then everybody wanted. So he put in production a batch of what was called a Type 52, a very clever, initially exact half-scale version of the Grand Prix car. Later, the chassis was lengthened slightly to put it a little bit out of scale, but to give a little bit more room for the slightly older children, because everybody wanted to drive one. Even the grown-ups wanted to buy them. And he finished up producing, we're not quite sure how many, but something over 150 of these cars were produced and sold to the children of the rich. Indeed, there was a race on one occasion at Deauville when about 25 of these cars turned up with young kids and created quite a sensation. The outstanding feature of the 35B, that's the 2.3-litre supercharged racing car, was its extraordinary flexibility of the engine. It really could be driven like an ordinary touring car. It wasn't so good in traffic, but then there wasn't much traffic in those days. It could be driven and potted in top gear at 15 miles an hour quite happily. And Bugatti realized that what he ought to do now was to produce a sports car version using that engine. So he literally put together from pieces which he had available a superb car which eventually became the Type 43, which was the 2.3-litre racing engine producing some 125 horsepower, something of that order, into a chassis based upon an earlier touring car similar to the what was called the Type 38, but rather heavier, with a heavier and more robust frame. A new gearbox, perfectly good gearbox with a central change, excellent brakes, and he preserved, curiously enough, the aluminum wheels, which were very attractive visually, and people liked them because they looked original. Just as today one specifies aluminum wheels on sports cars, so Bugatti was undoubtedly the first manufacturer to do this in 1927. Anyway, this produced the world's first genuine 100-mile-an-hour sports car. It was certainly a quasi-four-seater, and it was commercially very successful. It sold for even more money than the full-blooded racing car. And surprisingly enough, just as today people can afford to buy Ferraris, so in 1927 and 1928, the wealthy sportsman could afford to buy a Type 43. And no less than 160 of these were produced in the next 4-year period. The 16-cylinder car was an idea which Bugatti had when he wanted more power in his cars. This was in 1927 and 1928, when he began to realize that the Type 35B would need to have a major improvement in power, which he could only do at the time by more cylinders. He had produced a 16-cylinder double bank aero engine in the war, very successfully in fact, the one that had been licensed to America. And he thought then of doing the same thing by using what was basically two of his 1.5-litre 8-cylinder engines, putting the two parallel crankshafts geared together with a single drive. And he produced a prototype car called the Type 47, which had this engine, and then the rest of it was more or less similar, strengthened up or made bigger as the case may be, but similar chassis layout to the conventional 35. He produced this and only made one, then discovered by 1929, when racing in Europe became a bit of a shambles. Nobody could agree what the racing formula was going to be. The main makers withdrew from racing as they couldn't afford it due to financial conditions. And he abandoned work, having produced this one car, which ran and one or two hill climbs, but never achieved anything. This is the Model 44, which Bugatti brought out in 1926. It was his first really successful big engine touring model. Previously, he'd only made cars up to 2 litres, and now he produced a 3-litre car, which is really 2 cylinder blocks from the 4-cylinder engine, 69 millimeter bore and 100 millimeter stroke. And this produced a splendid 8-cylinder car. This particular car has had its carburetors modified. They used to be American Chevrolet carburetors, a single one, but the car runs rather better on the twin modern SUs. I mean modern in Bugatti sense, but really pre-war. It uses the same aluminium cam box on top and the 2 cast iron cylinder blocks on top of an aluminium crankcase. But the main feature now was a plain bearing crankshaft with 9 plain bearings, which got rid of a lot of the noise of the earlier roller bearing engine and was certainly a bit smoother. This enabled Bugatti for the first time to have really good touring cars, and many people will tell you that the 44 is one of the best of the pre-1930 touring models which he produced. Most of the cars were sent out as chassis for you to specify your own coach putter, Van Vooren or what have you. But Bugatti started then to make bodies. He started production of his own body shop about 1927 or 28, and some of the bodies he produced were absolute masterpieces of quality. I think here we have to begin to acknowledge the influence of his son Jean, who was becoming of age about that time. I suppose one of the most important features of any car is its radiator badge. It's the sort of symbol of the vehicle. And certainly the Bugatti badge is a very fine example of that sort of art, if you can call it that. If you take a bar or tube, which is the correct diameter for the height of the badge, 45 millimeters in this case, and if you cut it at 30 degrees, as schoolboys should know from their trigonometry lessons, you get an ellipse, which is 2 to 1, twice as long as it is high. And that shape is the perfect Bugatti radiator badge shape, which you can see by fitting one onto it. There were 2 types of badge, basically, one with square dots and one with round dots. Most of them have round dots around the edges. I've never been able to find out exactly when he changed over. Somewhere about 1929 or 1930, he changed over from square to round. But it's a piece of research we've not been able to complete. Now we have to tell the tale of the extraordinary Bugatti Royale. We know from evidence in a letter from Bugatti to one of his friends before the First World War that even in that time he was thinking of producing a car to equal the Rolls-Royce or the Hispano-Suiza of the period. But quite clearly he didn't have the resources. After the war, he did produce a prototype which was the beginnings of his thinking. But again, clearly, at that time, he hadn't got the means. But by 1926, when his production was flowing at full steam and his racing cars were the talk of the world racing scene and he won the world championship, he was able then to start working on his monster car. This was to be the biggest and best car ever produced. It finished up, indeed, as the largest engine car ever produced and put on the market. To those who remember the pre-war RAC rating of engines, when the ordinary car was a Morris 8 RAC or a Austin 10, his was 78 RAC rating, which was almost twice as large as the corresponding Rolls-Royce of the period. What he did was he took an engine which was basically an aero engine for which he'd had a contract in 1923 from the French government, we believe, for a 12 or 14 litre aero engine. He took the engine, this 8-cylinder engine from that, and put it in a new chassis which he built, a really monstrous large chassis, but bristling with interesting technical details. The whole car, in fact, is an engineering masterpiece in one sense and a disaster in another, in the sense that everything was specialized, very expensive, and very special purpose. However, He produced initially one of these cars, and he put on it a body of a Packard, which he'd bought at the 1926 Paris show, of a good, high-quality American car. He put that body on his large Royale car. Look at these enormous wheels and enormous aluminium cast wheels. And anyway, that was the prototype which he used for testing. And then he put on that chassis, in fact, a variety of bodies for demonstration purposes. Curiously enough, in spite of the interest this car created in 1927 when it was being driven about, he wasn't able to sell one until 1932. He got his first order for this. Meanwhile, he must have had a lot of stock. He certainly had a lot of engines lying around. His first order was, in fact, to a French clothing manufacturer called Esders, a sort of Mr. Marks or Spencer's of the period. On this was put a beautiful two-seater roadster body, now designed by his son Jean, or designed in the sense that the line of the body was produced undoubtedly by Jean. Mr. Esders did not drive at night, so he didn't bother to put headlamps on it. In fact, this body, which unfortunately was taken off and changed later on, was probably one of the best-looking cars that was ever produced, although exaggerated in extreme in the sense that so large a car could surely carry more than 2 passengers. Then he sold a drop-head coupe to a German doctor, evidently left Germany, as many other German doctors did at the period, and went to Shanghai and then to America, and was discovered derelict and preserved and is now in the Ford Museum. The third car was built for an Englishman called Foster, and this was bodied with a rather nice but rather classic-looking coach body, a Park Ward saloon, which was in England for many years until it was sold to an American called Shakespeare and then bought back by the famous Fritz Schlumpf in the early 60s, back to France, and is now in the National Museum in Mulhouse. These were the only 3 cars that Bugatti sold of the Royales. The prototype was eventually rebodied with a rather handsome Coupe Napoleon, it's called, and this was retained by the family until again it was bought by Schlumpf and is now in the Mulhouse Museum. The Esders Roadster, that was rebodied with a Coupe de Ville by the coach builder Binder, and that was eventually bought after the war by an American soldier, actually, taken back to America, a very handsome body. The other 2 cars which remain in the family and were reputed to have been preserved during the war in the cellars or the catacombs of the French sewerage system. Whether that story is true, I don't know, but it sounds an amusing one. Anyway, these 2 cars were preserved in the family and both sold to the American sports millionaire Briggs Cunningham after the war. The first one had a rather handsome coach by Kellner and remained until recently in the Briggs Cunningham Museum. Indeed, is the only Royale car in recent years which has been exercised out, as it were, like a horse, frequently taken out, warmed up, and driven. And indeed, it's the only Royale I've had the pleasure of having a drive in. The last car was a curious horse-drawn style body called a berline de voyage, with a sort of double fiacre-shaped thing. That again went to America and sold to the Harrow Museum, but again has recently been sold. Although commercially the Royale was a disaster and really was the car of kings, for kings, which no king ever bought, it did have one interesting byproduct. Because Bugatti had produced a lot of the engines, he had a whole batch of these available, which he had not been able to sell. And then the French government did a very interesting thing in the early 30s. There was a great deal of unemployment in the French railways. And they put contracts out to various people, including Bugatti, to produce a design for a new type of rail car for local communication or indeed high-speed communication on longer routes. And Bugatti was very much tickled by this, set up an office of his own in Paris, and proceeded to design a very beautiful rail car which used 4 of these Royale engines. And it really was a splendid design, full of novel features, an excellent bogie, very clever rubber suspended wheels. The tires on the wheels were insulated by rubber from the track. Clever suspension system between the bogie and the body of the vehicle. Excellent paneling on the body, big windows, very ingenious seats. By reversing the back, flopping them over, you could sit either way. A sort of cabin for the driver up the top, so he could view either way. He could just turn around and drive the thing the other way. The whole thing was very novel, very, very good performance. It wasn't long, in fact, before Bugatti got the world speed record on rail of 130 miles an hour, odd for the period. Initially, they went between Paris and Deauville and really ran rather well and created a great deal of interest. People used to say they were taking the Bugatti, meaning the Bugatti train. This went on quite successfully until about 1938, when the French railways were nationalized, and by that time the fuel consumption problem was really excessive, and Bugatti realized there was no future for an alcohol-burning engine, and he started playing around with steam engines, and indeed there was some attempt at doing a diesel engine. But by that time, the financial situation in France, the war scares and whatnot, put an end to all this, and production of rail cars ceased just before the war, although they remained in service until well after the war. If Bugatti's Royale did not sell, Bugatti still wanted to have a deluxe car. He could not let go the market for the supercar, the Rolls-Royce and the Hispano and the Zottofficini market. So at the end of 1929 and beginning of 1930, he produced a magnificent car, which we know is the Type 46. This is a large 8-cylinder car, similar in conception to the Royale, but much smaller. It had only got just over a 5-liter engine, and is a much more sensible car to produce. It had some of the features of the Royale, for example, the 3-speed gearbox in the back axle, not separate, and really was certainly the best of the deluxe cars that Bugatti produced. Most of these went out in chassis form for the famous coach builders of France and indeed England, but a number were bodied with splendid coachwork from Molsheim. This car was actually quite successful, and Bugatti called it his Petit Royale. So there's quite a few of them about. Another very interesting feature of Bugatti, typical of the man really, was his choice of nuts and bolts. His very first cars, up till about 1921, made use of standard metric nuts and bolts, which you could buy commercially quite cheaply. And for some reason or other, he changed over to a different series of diameters. Instead of using the common metric even numbers, 6, 8, 10, he used odd numbers. He used 5, 7, 9, and a very unusual 11 millimeter bolt, which meant that people had to go to him for the nuts and bolts. He also introduced what is technically a very good feature, that is a nut with an integral washer, which means, of course, that you can't use hexagon bar. You have to mill the hexagons by 3 different pairs of operations, which means the nuts are expensive, but they are very good. Okay. Another important feature is, in fact, the chassis plate, which identifies the actual car. These were, unfortunately, held on most of the cars by long nails because the dash had a wooden backing. These happened to be 2 original plates which I got from the factory, which were cars which were never issued, and as such are clearly of importance, and they're guarded very carefully to avoid them getting into the wrong hands. An amusing sidelight on this was when the files from Roland Bugatti were acquired by Mr. Uwe Hooke in the south of France, he found a letter from the Pracht, who was the secretary at Molsheim, to a Mr. Becky, saying, "Dear sir, we by mistake put on the wrong number on your car. We stamped your car 40813 when it should be 40823. Here's the badge, complete with nails. Would you please change it and put the right badge on?" Unfortunately, nobody seemed able to have traced Mr. Becky, and therefore the badge was never actually put on the proper car. Another typical Bugatti trick, he had his own dusters, which he supplied his workmen. In most factories you can get cleaning rag issued to you, for obvious reasons, but it was typical Bugatti that he had to have a cotton type material with his name engraved on. There were apparently two types, one with Bugatti across the middle and the other with a more discreet Bugatti in the corner. These are extremely rare, and unfortunately it's a type of weave, cotton weave, which is no longer made. Otherwise we'd be happy to get replicas of these so that Bugatti owners today could clean their cars with genuine Bugatti type dusters. Almost everything to do with Bugatti is becoming a collector's piece. Here's an amusing little thing, a visiting card by Jean Bugatti himself in his own little envelope, absolutely brand new. And of course the same thing by Mr. Ettore Bugatti. We now have to refer to the influence of Bugatti's son, Jean. Jean had been born in 1909 and obviously was therefore 21 in 1930. He was clearly beginning to exert an influence on his father by the end of the 20s, and it must have been due to him that Bugatti realized that his 35B engine really would have to be modified and improved, basically, if it was to survive the competition from the Alfa Romeos and the others of the period. The significant step was the arrival on the scene in Europe in 1929 of an American called Leon Duret, who brought over a couple of Miller racing cars, which had been very successful at Indianapolis. Bugatti arranged to exchange with Leon Duret 3 Type 43 models, the 8-cylinder super sports cars, for the 2 Miller racing cars, which had been relatively successful and clearly were very fast. He took one of the engines out and put it on test and got well over 200 horsepower out of that engine, which is about 30 horsepower more than Bugatti had seen on his comparable engine. We know for a fact that one of the engines was taken to pieces and the cylinder head construction drawn out, and then Bugatti produced an engine version using this twin overhead camshaft construction which Miller had, and the hemispherical head with 2 inclined valves rather than Bugatti's 3-valve layout with the valves vertically. An engine was produced on this basis and adapted to suit the standard 35B lower half of the engine. The crankshaft and the crankcase itself was absolutely unchanged. This enabled Bugatti to produce an improved model of his 35, which eventually was called the Type 51. A few other improvements were seen at the same time. For example, he put the modern type tire, wheelbase rims as it were, on the wheels rather than the detachable rim of the earlier type tire, and he put 2 filler caps on the fuel tank instead of 1 to make it easier to get the fuel in, for example. And this produced probably the best looking racing car Bugatti ever produced, the most beautiful Type 51. Curiously enough, although they were working on this engine and must have been running it, the first engine that was in fact adapted and put on the market with this construction of twin overhead camshaft was indeed a version of the Type 46, the 5-liter Little Royale car, which we've talked about, the touring car. That was done to produce a model called the Type 50, identical in all details from the other car, except that it had twin overhead camshafts, and of course that particular model was supercharged. The chassis of the Type 50 was basically similar to that of the Type 46. He did make a few minor changes. but it still preserved the same front axle, and the other important feature was the gearbox in the rear axle with only 3 speeds. There was so much power and torque of the engine that it certainly didn't need more than 3 speeds. In fact, a car like this can be driven more or less everywhere in top gear with considerable flexibility. While he was racing the Type 51 2.3 litre car in events for which that size car was suitable, he also had to produce this great big 5 litre car called the Type 54. It was a monster car, very fast. By that time, a car of that size and weight and power with a rigid front axle and mechanical brakes was really outdated technically. It was not very good in holding the road, and the braking wasn't really up to it. And clearly, by that time, Bugatti, although he had the power of a car, he didn't have the conceptual thinking of a suitable car, and therefore the car was not really successful. It is an Italian engineer called Capo, who has been a senior engineer at Fiat. He had a design consultancy company in Milan, and he came to Bugatti one day with a design for a four-wheel drive car, thinking that Bugatti might be interested because he had this new engine, which we've mentioned, going into the Type 50 touring car, obviously a very high-powered engine. An excellent Italian engineer called Picchetto, who was one of the designers working for Capo, he was sent to Molsheim, and he spent the next couple of years designing this Type 53, it's called, four-wheel drive Bugatti car, the Bugatti Quattro of the period. They were fast, very good on hill climbs, but very heavy steering to handle. Although the ideas were known at the period, the technology was there, Bugatti was not able apparently to understand the need for what we nowadays call constant velocity universal joints. There's a tendency for the wheels, when you go around a corner, to straighten up when you put a torque on them. This is got over on the modern four-wheel drive car by these constant velocity joints. You avoid the problem by an engineering solution. Bugatti's car did not have this, and it was therefore relatively difficult to steer under high torque conditions. I remember talking, for example, to René Dreyfus, the famous driver who had driven one of these. He said that by the time he'd finished the climb, he was really exhausted from steering. We can remind ourselves that Bugatti had very successfully produced the Type 43, which was the Grand Sport version of the supercharged 35B racing car, and produced the world's first 100-mile-an-hour sports car. When the twin-overhead camshaft 51 came along, its road manners, in fact, and the way it would handle in traffic, was, if anything, even better than a 35B. It was common sense for Jean Bugatti, who was then running the factory, to produce a super sports version of the racing car, which he did under the designation Type 55. And then by putting the twin-overhead camshaft 2.3 litre 51 engine in the 47 chassis frame, and surrounding it with a very handsome roadster body, Jean produced what many people will call the best-looking sports car ever produced, the Type 55. The feature of the body was, first of all, long sweeping mudguards or wings with a very fine continuous line, similar indeed and presumably inspired by the Roadster Royale which he'd produced for the Esders order. That was put onto a body which had no doors, merely cutaway sides. The whole lines of the body were really very elegant indeed, although admittedly there was some criticism of some of the diehards in this country, at least, I don't know about other countries, when the car produced, it looked rather Americanized. Anyway, this was a very successful car. It had a better performance than the 43. It would do about 110 miles an hour instead of 100. They only produced 38 of them, and there's some 22 or 24 still in existence. He needed to produce a new touring car. It was obvious, even to the father, that the son was right, that the classic Bugatti design was now outmoded. He had to go over to the twin cam construction, which he'd shown on the racing car was producing significantly more power, and indeed was, from many points of view, simpler. Certainly the cylinder head was more reliable. You didn't get the cracked valve seats you got on the earlier model. The first attempt was to design a 3.3-litre touring car which had the model Type 57. This was relatively new from stem to stern. Although the conception of the chassis was similar, it still had rigid front springs. The gearbox was now bolted straight onto the engine, and the gearbox had constant mesh gears, meaning that it was a silent change, although there was no synchro mesh in those days, certainly not in Europe, although it was beginning to be developed in the United States. The 57 production was delayed probably because there was not the finance to launch it properly, and they continued producing the earlier Type 49 3.3-litre car, the single cam version. But in parallel, because Bugatti was Bugatti, some of the effort had to go into racing cars. Instead of putting the finance available into the production of the touring car, the finance went into developing a racing version of the same engine as the touring car. This was called the Type 59. This was conceptually completely new chassis frame, new gearbox. The engine was derived from the touring one, the cylinder block. It had dry sump, for example. That means that it had no oil tank and 2 oil pumps and a different back axle. Now, in order to lower the seating position in the car, it used a double reduction back axle, meaning that the prop shaft was lowered and there were 2 sets of gears in the back axle, one to raise a low prop shaft up to the ordinary level of the axle, the conventional crown wheel and pinion to turn the drive at right angles to the wheels. An interesting feature of this, which Ettore himself was responsible for, was an incredible wire wheel with wire spokes only disposed radially, unlike the ordinary wire wheel where the spokes are disposed fore and aft as well as radially, so they can carry torque. Bugatti's spokes could not carry any torque or torsion or braking loads. That was transmitted direct from the back plate of the wheel to the rim by means of gear teeth between the two. It was claimed to be lighter. It probably was a little bit lighter than the conventional wheel, but although aesthetically very satisfying, most beautiful wheel, one can only question whether it was really worth the effort. Although typically Bugatti, it was produced and people used them, and today, of course, they're collector's pieces. The Type 59 was the last Bugatti racing car which was produced in any numbers. About 6 were produced. Quite clearly, although they had some success, it was not going to be able to compete with the competition on the horizon, competition from state-financed Italian Alfa Romeos and German Mercedes and German Auto Union cars, which were now going to dominate the whole scene on racing. Certainly by 1938, the Germans were the only ones in contention at all, and Bugatti was outmoded. Now Bugatti realized by 1935 that he could not continue, and the 4 finished Type 59 racing cars were all sold to Britain, and so from then on Bugatti only raced 1 or possibly 2 chassis which he retained, and he entered them in French sports car races, and that's all he could do, all he could afford to do. About 1935, when the production of the 57 touring car was well underway, Jean Bugatti obviously wanted to produce a more sporting version, and what he did was to use some of the experience gained on the Racing 59 engine, improved features as a dry sump lubrication, with an extra oil tank, and produced a version of the engine called the 57S, which is very similar in general appearance to the standard 57, but at a higher compression ratio and other features which allowed it to produce more power. Well, this was put in a new frame, much lower, the feature of which is that the rear axle actually passes through holes in the frame in order to keep the body line low. This was produced with the new engine and a lower mounted radiator and a lower scuttle, and was then sold in chassis form and had some very handsome bodies put on it by various coach builders. A few bodies were also produced by Bugatti themselves, including the exotic Atlantic, which made use of a construction first seen on the Racing 59, namely that the panels were riveted together instead of being welded along a spine down the center of the body, or the center of the mudguards, as the case may be, and the rivets being allowed to show rather on the lines of aircraft, although there is some evidence that the original intention was to use magnesium electron sheet rather than aluminum sheet, which would complicate the problem of welding because magnesium is not easy to weld. And therefore they may have gone to rivets to avoid this, although in practice all the bodies that we've seen were produced in light alloy in the ordinary way. This car was soon in production in limited numbers, and immediately everybody wanted to add a supercharger to it to make it go even faster. Many of the cars went back to the factory and were converted by the addition of the blower, and some of the new ones came out from ab initio with the blowers attached to be called the 57SC, S for sport, C for compressor. The production actually ceased at the beginning of 37 because of excessive cost. It quite clearly, of the 35 or 40 cars produced, they could not have possibly made any money on them because they were sold too cheap and they cost too much to make. And it was obviously soon that they would have to stop playing around, as we might say, with these sports cars and get on producing the standard 57. Although one benefit that the addition of the supercharger on the 57 SC model gave was the addition of a supercharger onto the standard 57 to produce the 57C, which from many points of view was the best of all the touring Bugattis. And indeed the last 100 or so cars that were made up to the beginning of the war were in the version 57C.
The second is the three cars that model which is here. This originally had a coupe body and was subsequently fitted with the Jean Bugatti design roadster body of
Bugatti had produced the 57S, and he immediately took steps to adapt it for racing and producing what was called later on the 57G. There were 3 cars produced like this for the 1936 French Grand Prix, which was run for sports cars at Montlhéry. The feature of these cars was a very handsome, streamlined body. We still call them tank bodies, along the lines of the original tanks from the 1923 Tour Grand Prix. Long, elongated bodies, fully enveloping the wheels, and presumably of low aerodynamic drag. They certainly had a good performance and fast. They ran at Montlhéry for the 1936 French Grand Prix and won that. Then they ran in 1937 and won at Le Mans, and then a slightly modified version with a different chassis, still called the 57G, and a supercharged 57C engine, won at 1939 at Le Mans. Bugatti had won the Le Mans 24-hour race in June 1939. A few weeks later, Jean Bugatti took the same car out to test it for another race and was killed. He was trying to avoid drunken cyclists, the story goes. This was on August 11th. 2 weeks after that, war came, and Bugatti once more saw his factory invaded, first of all by the French army, who took it over as a transport depot, and then in June 1940 by the Germans. He, being Italian, was evidently allowed at that time to remain in France unmolested, and eventually spent the rest of the war in Paris, designing many, many things that never saw the light of day. Let us try and draw a conclusion from this brief history of the life of Ettore Bugatti and his son Jean. Suppose Jean had not died. He was undoubtedly a talented designer. He was probably a better engineer as such than Ettore was. He didn't have perhaps his flair for design, but he was still a very competent young man. Could the company have continued after the war had Jean survived and had Bugatti himself not died in the middle of a struggle to get his factory back? I think myself that the thing would not have succeeded. It's quite clear from the evidence we've got that the company was in severe financial difficulty. The car designs were not modern enough to sell very well, only to a specialized clientele. The rail car orders had dried up because the French railways no longer wanted to buy vehicles driven with alcohol fuel. And I think it's fair to say that there was no chance of Bugatti surviving, even had Jean not been killed. Then after he died, the factory messed about, I suppose is the best way to put it, trying to resuscitate the 57 under a new title, the 101. But there really wasn't a market for a car with a solid front axle and the characteristics which were considered good before the war. Everybody wanted more modern cars, things like heating systems, certainly safety, and the various comforts which you get with a modern car. So the conclusion I personally draw is that Bugatti had no place had he survived, and from one point of view it's better that the company ceased to trade.